So, hello. This is Today we're going to look at the seven seals of the apocalypse. And there's quite a nice overlap between this and if people have been reading the Goldfoot story, we're relating this back also to the experience of the tower when the apprentice is locked in the tower. So here behind me, we have the cube. This is the seventh seal that comes. The cube is the heavenly Jerusalem that comes down out of the spiritual world, and it's formed with these exactly perpendicular forms of the different dimensions of space, the depth, the heights, and the widths of space. So I'm going to look at this. First of all, we're going to look at a few quotes from Rudolf Steiner and some quotes from Judith von Haller in relation to this. And then we're going to look at verses 13 and 14 from Revelation. So 14 is where the heavenly Jerusalem is mentioned, and 13 is where we have the depiction of the beast. So I'm going to bring this in relation to translations that I've done, recent new translations I've done of Rudolf Steiner's mantras from the first class meditations. And we're going to just look at the changes I've made to some of those words and how they're normally translated to give a better, what I feel is a better rendition in English of some of those translations. So we're going to look at that at the end. Now, how are we going to get there is going to be a bit like a story. So we're going to look at this seventh image first and just remind ourselves, first of all, when you're working with any story or any text that someone has produced, the advice is to look at the writer of the text themselves. So it's good here for us to call to mind John as the writer of the apocalypse himself, and think back into the Bible, first of all, that John comes to Christ as the rich young man and then asks about finding the kingdom of heaven. And this is where Christ then says to him, it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven as a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And this is a very, very pregnant imagination. And this imagination, it's advisable for us to go into this imagination and to understand what that means for that big, bulky body of a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Now, what does that mean for us? What does it mean? It's an impossible picture. And that's exactly why it's such a powerful picture for what we need to do, because that's the dexterousness of our fingers to be able to weave that thread through the eye of a needle. What this is speaking to is our thinking. So it is our thinking, our ability to think in these images, in this understanding of the spiritual world, that helps us weave these threads. And we'll see later how this is important when we talk about the meaning of a net. In German, a Netz, a net. and how this relates to perhaps more in popular culture, how we speak of a matrix of into which we are interlaced. So these references, these understandings of this relationship between our thinking and how we are interwoven with the world is something that's underlying everything that we'll be looking at today in relation to this seventh seal and the apocalypse as a whole. So I'll try and also briefly mention some of the other images in the seals that we have here, and just also mention something about John. After this meeting with Christ, he's then brought out of the cave in what Rudolf Steiner speaks of here as the new form of initiation, that this happens outside of the mysteries, out in life. So John falls after hearing that a rich man as he is, and here rich as in his experience, in his karma to have met Christ at this point. This is the richness that's being spoken of, and the whole wealth of his experience up to this point is for him a devastating moment where he sees that all of his qualities, everything he's developed up to this point, will not prepare him for what's necessary to go through this initiation. And this is something we can all face in the modern world, where we come to the point that all of our abilities, perhaps our education, perhaps our achievements in life, are not going to be enough to enable us to go through that death within life, to achieve this initiation and to be called forth as John is called forth from the cave, from his death within life. We remember he's in the cave for 4 days until the point where Mary and Martha speak of him as if he stinks. And it's after 4 days that Christ then calls him forth, come forth, and he comes then out of the cave. But it's this moment where John hears the preaching of Christ, when he feels that the words are speaking to him, and he falls then into this crisis, this catharsis of his soul, where he sees that he's going to have to change his whole world around 180 degrees. And how that happens, the whole esoterics of how that happens and what happens during that initiation, is something we can look at another time in relation also to John the Baptist. Now, after this, John goes then, after the crucifixion and after the tumultuous events after the crucifixion and also the persecution of the other apostles, he's going down to Patmos, and that's where the apocalypse is composed. And this figure that you can't see up above me, this is the figure of Christ that John is met with in the, so I'll see if I can, that's made it even worse. So you can see here at the top, but this is when John falls down. It's written in the Bible as if dead. And before him stands this figure of Christ. And he holds then the keys on his hand here, around his hand. You can't see them very well here. You got the 12 signs around him, but then the 7 planets around his right hand, his mouth breathing this fiery sword coming out of his mouth, and a girdle and a white robe. And all these things are significant, but today we're going to look at this middle figure, the 7th seal with the cube. So you can see the cube at the bottom here. A better depiction of this I have here in so this is a much better depiction. Can you see that? Oh dear. Let's try again. Here we go. So yeah, this is a better depiction here of this 7th seal. And so what you can see here is very nicely the watery aspect of this cube. Now, Rudolf Steiner speaks here of this being transparent, this transparent cube and its water-like nature. And what I'd like to encourage us to do is these seals are really only as understandable as we work with them inwardly in our own imagination. So let's firstly think into how this works in how we imagine these dimensions of time, space, height, breadth, and width. So if you think, if you sit there and you think of how the pushing away gesture is how if you push away so far with the flat of your hand, you'll form a flat space. Now you can push this before you out to the widths of space. You can push this equally above you up to the heights of space. And you can push this down to the depths of space. And this is an inner exploration of what it means to do these things with our consciousness. And it's quite helpful here. This is a quote from Rudolf Steiner. Space and counter space. The cube has 3 perpendicular directions, 3 axes, length, height, and breadth. It thus represents the 3 dimensions in space. Now imagine the counter dimensions to these 3 outside dimensions of the physical world. You may visualize this by imagining someone moving in one direction and colliding with someone else coming from another direction. Similarly, there is a counter dimension to every dimension of space, so that in all we have 6 counter rays. Now you can see this quite nicely here in the tails of the snakes. So this here, you see each of the tails of the snakes touches a different surface of the cube. Now, this is how we are working with space and counter space. And I would encourage you again, as we're reflecting on these dimensions of space inwardly, if you depict yourself going out into space and imagine what that creates. By you going into that space, you've created all of the counter space from which you are leaving. Now, if we think about this, about our lives as a whole, and this is one of the deeper imaginations in one of the other seals, it describes the book of life. And the book of life, how when we first taste it, is sweet as honey. Everything is possible in life. And yet when we digest it, it becomes bitter. This bitter knowledge that we are called to account for every deed that we do out there in space. So you see how space and time here are creating two kinds of abyss for our subjectivity. When we go out into space, we create an abyss behind us. And when we do this within time, this is also creating an abyss in time, because our subjectivity is pushing something away from us. Everything that we deny is then outside of us. But on the spiritual path, we're trying to reach this point where we don't reject anything, that we're becoming more one with everything around us, whether that be time or space or the other abyss, which is the human heart. Now, you can see in another position where Steiner speaks of this interweaving of the sun and the moon in a different understanding as how we materialistically see the world, is represented here by the two snakes. And again, what I would encourage you to do if you want to work with this seal is to recognize how that interplay through the course of the seasons, or through the course of the moon, through the months, how the sun and the moon are interweaving as these two snakes. Now, what all this enables, this threefold times two, this sixfold relation of space to counter space, is it enables the three higher rings that we have at the top, and then the chalice which is containing the dove. And all of this is showing us the path of catharsis, of purification, that when we bring all this to mind, enables the spirit to sink down into us. And so we have this twofold nature here. We have the building of our understanding of the cube with its perpendicular equal surfaces, which enable then the three higher members to start to become active and visible for us. Around them, we then have the seven colors of the rainbow, which refers also back to the seven planets that we saw right at the beginning with Christ when he appears to John at the beginning. And then we have the letters around the outside. So in another place, we're referring to the sevenfold, the seventh seal with its sevenfold creative being of the rainbow and its colors here. It's referred to as the Grail as the cube here, and the Grail here as the heavenly Jerusalem. So the water that we experience in this cube is this experience of the water of life as we experience it as a manifestation of our own growing spiritual subjectivity, as we're becoming more conscious of this whole process. Now, this might sound quite abstract. And again, rather than getting bogged down in the explanation of these things, my encouragement for you and for anyone who's going into the meditation on these seals is simply to do what I've said, which is to experience this heights, widths, and depths through a feeling for how it's very exact. These squares, which are nowhere found in these square forms in nature, to recognize that this exact thinking of how we form these squares with the different dimensions is something that we can do simply through regarding our life and regarding ourselves as we move out into space, into life. And so it's a very good meditation to come back and just regard yourself and see yourself from outside. And to the extent that you do this, working with this fourfold nature, first of all, with the fact that you are a physical being there positioned at a certain point in space. Secondly, that you are an astral being. You have your desires, you have your thoughts and ideas about life. And this has shaped the life that you have formed for yourself. So if we then recognize this as another wall that we have created, another surface that we have created, that when we've gone out to it, we've formed another side of the cube. Now, the other side, we can see that to the extent that we go out into life with our desires, our ambitions, our passions in life, there's also a growing process of how we adapt to life and how we form our character. And this is, again, something that's coming throughout esoteric teaching and spiritual teaching, that we have to develop our character to be worthy of the ideas that we're studying. So, like Rudolf Steiner says, so often and so fundamental to the spiritual path, for every step in spiritual knowledge, we have to make 3 steps in moral development. And here you see what the astral experience is, which forms one of the surfaces. Immediately we're starting to recognize the influence of another of the surfaces, which is the etheric. And this is our life body. How have we incorporated our ideas into life? How have we brought insights, spiritual experience into the shape of our character and our lives? This has formed another surface of the cube. So we have here the astral, the physical, the etheric, and then we see within all these things, we have our ich. Whatever we do, whatever we think, however we form our character, and wherever we are in terms of our bodies, we have an ich over against this experience. We always have the possibility to take a step back, a step outside, and to regard what it is that we've done. This consciousness over against an experience is what's called here the ich, the I. We can say I to ourselves. there are exact laws for things, but we can see ourselves independently of an experience. Now, this experience of the I, and again, in our meditation, we can then go through each of these levels. We can test our consciousness in the physical. We can test it in relation to ideas and passions and instincts. We can test it in terms of our character. And this testing, within doing all this, we can then come to this experience of an independent aspect of ourselves that is able to regard and observe all these processes. And this is our experience of our I. Now, this can give us another surface to the cube. So we've got these 4 experiences of the cube. Now, these 4, we have then the 4 walls of the cube. To the extent that we work with our I into our ideas, into our character, into our desires and ambitions, into the physical, all of this we are bringing up on the spiritual path to an imaginative experience. And all of these depictions of the seals are wonderful imaginations of what it means to go through some of these experiences. So we see here the dragon with Michael and the dragon here on the one side. We've got here the woman clothed in the sun stepping on the moon over against a 7-headed dragon. And we have here the book of life between the pillars. And as we saw before, Christ and his appearance before us at this point, as John experiences this turning inward to receive revelation. And all of these seals and pictures are experiences that we can bring in relation to our inner life. And to the extent that we really think into them and think about how they relate to our lives, it's to this extent that they can start to live really in us. So going back to now what we have here is these letters around the seal, which relate to what Steiner here calls the world secret. And firstly, we have ex Deo nascimur, out of God I am born, in Christo morimur, death in life in Christ, and per spiritum revivissimus, resurrection in the spirit. Now we've got here also a quote I'd like to bring here, firstly from Rudolf Steiner, and then from Judith von Haller, who's also referring here to the 7th seal. So firstly, from Rudolf Steiner, the seals and their symbolic meaning. The 7 pictures that decorate the hall are symbolic expressions for quite specific ancient truths. They represent the so-called 7 seals of ancient and ever-new wisdom. This is spoken of in the Apocalypse of John, and this apocalypse is a kind of interpretation of an esoteric symbol language. Whoever studies the seals will recognize the images in the visions of the writer of the Apocalypse. Every letter, every color of the seals means something. When we look at them together in the right way and sense the connection, quite specific feelings are released, which can engender an inner strength. Judith von Haller. Man thereby finally experiences that spatial network as soon as the sense world, which he once thought to be his boundless outer world, has cut itself off from the superspatial living place of its creator's spirit, exists solely for the purpose of helping him himself at the point of its greatest condensation to the independent realization of his spiritual origin. This consciousness releases new forces with which he no longer only recognizes the borders of the inner world, which he has left at that net as such, but pushes through them. There's two aspects of this, so I'll just leave it up there for you can read through while you're listening. There's two aspects of this that I think are particularly poignant, and that is the speaking of quite specific feelings that are released from doing this meditation, and that when one has felt this net into which one is interwoven, the experience then of breaking through and pushing through this net and coming out on the other side. And if we think of perhaps of Matrix reference, or indeed the reference that we had at the beginning to this weaving of threads, is also a very lovely depiction of how we can be interwoven in a net and how we can come to push through this. And part of this is, as we have looked at, this experience of the cube and how we form this cube for ourselves very much through exact thinking. And this exact thinking and imagination, when we also push with this to experience these aspects of space, this is what comes to build this cube. And we can start to feel that, how we have done this, especially with regard to the fourfold physical, etheric, astral, and ich, and then to develop these other two, the spirit self and the life spirit. And this experience, these terms, these are helpful for us to start to designate and think about how we relate to these different areas of our experience. Spirit self is then how we have brought our experience into imagination. So whether this is aspects of our biography or aspects of our daily sensual experience, to the extent that we have brought these into imagination and we start to live in this imagination, this is how we develop our spirit self. Now, we can also experience this as the upper surface of the cube. As soon as we do this, we are faced again with the extent to which we have brought this into our character, and this forms the bottom surface of the cube. So you see that the three higher members leading up to the experience of the creative word of Christ as it comes into these three higher members, this is the experience of how we start to develop our appreciation of spirit man. And these three are reflected in the letters as I spoke of them before. Out of God I am born, in Christo morimur, death within life, and per spiritum revivissimus, resurrection in the spirit. Now, all of this in the Bible comes after the beast that arises out of the waters. And this confrontation with the beast, this is where I'd like to, without going into this, you can read about the arising of the beast out of the waters in Revelation 13, which comes before Revelation 14, where the cube and the dimensions of the heavenly Jerusalem are spoken of. But what we're going to look at here now is the reference to the beasts in Rudolf Steiner from the first class. And this is the kind of meme that I did up for this. So I'm just going to read through. This is the mantra from the first class. And first of all, I've left out the first verse and the last verse. And in these verses, Rudolf Steiner speaks of how we have to be aware of this beast, these beasts, as we approach the threshold to the spiritual world. And if we weren't to perceive these beasts, the danger is that we would be unconscious of the things that are affecting us in our lives from the spiritual. And this is a challenge for all of us in the present times, in times of hypnosis and in times where words and images are used in all kinds of media and propaganda, that the effects of words and the effects of what we call the resistant powers, resistant because they are resistant to us, to humanity. They are providing this resistance to us. The danger is that we fall into unconsciousness. And so this is a very helpful beginning to any exploration of the spiritual, is that we become aware of how these three beasts function in relation to our thinking, our feeling, and our willing. The three beasts at the threshold are then introduced to us by the guardian of the threshold, who warns us not to take a step over the threshold to the spiritual world without being aware of our own lack of development in relation to these three areas of our being. If we become conscious of these three areas, then we may, what he describes in the last verse, grow wings to fly over this abyss. So, see the first beast, the back twisted, its bony head, parched is its body, totally from dull blue is its skin. Your fear of creative spirit being has made this monster in your will. Only courage for knowledge will overcome it. Behold the second beast. It bares its teeth in a grimacing face, mocking it lies. Yellow with grey spots is its body. Your hate of spiritual revelation begat this weakling in your feeling. Your fire for knowledge must tame it. See the third beast with split muzzle. Its eye is glassy, its slouching posture. Dirty red its form appears to you. your doubt in the power of spirit light brings this spectre of your thinking. Your creation of knowledge must soften it. So there's a few differences here to the original translation. I've changed ghost to spectre, and I speak here of a grimacing face, which is sometimes translated as a warped face, and then creative spirit being. So I'm just trying to bring in things that I feel are more attuned to the experience. So spectra, the image evoked when we say the word spectra, is very different to the sense of ghost. Spectre is thinner. Yeah, it doesn't have even the word itself, spectre, from ghost. And ghost has all these spooky connotations. And spectre, I think, speaks far better to this thin nature of how our thinking can become if we don't recognize the form of this third beast. And the other thing that's very helpful here is the glassy eye. We think of when we are intoxicated or on drugs, or that you see this kind of foggy, misty aspect of how the eyes glaze over. It's another nice expression. It's knowledge of how these things fit together that gives us form here. And it's this creation of knowledge which must soften this beast. And part of what I'm bringing here with the seventh seal is that some of this knowledge about how these things fit together, our study of this is the kind of knowledge which we can form, which is setting something against this third beast. The second beast, with its grimacing face, I think I've mentioned this before, also in relation to the experience of fear and hate. Fear we had in the first beast, fear to actually start studying some of these things, and then hate at spiritual revelation. Now, hate can also be hate of our own self-knowledge of where we are at in this process. And then comes all of the ways in which we project our own limitations onto other people. So it's really the basis of a lot of psychology in our lives, where hate of spiritual revelation can also be hate of others, because the spiritual is often going to speak to us through our lives, through others, however far removed those others might be. So whether we form a demon out of others in a political sphere, or whether we form hate for those closer to us in relationships or in work, all of this in its basis and its fundamental basis is a way in which we push away from ourselves knowledge and self-knowledge of the spiritual. But that's how it's manifested in everyday life. What we're looking at here is to form an imagination of this whole process and see where our hate of spiritual revelation is creating a weakling in us. And this grimacing face, we can experience this inwardly as a kind of shying away from things that we should really look at more carefully about how we are relating to life and how we are showing up in life, very broadly speaking. And the first beast, parched is its body, I think this is an experience that many people have had in different ways over the last few years, is because there's been so much fear around, and this is continually being ramped up through the media and through our whole culture, really, is all of the what Steiner calls the pseudo logical rules we give for what we deem is allowed and what is not allowed, and all of this defense against the spirit. So, this fear of creative spiritual being is a very interesting expression, because it's creativity and what we do creatively in life, which is really how we're bringing this knowledge and these new feelings that we encounter as we progress and develop ourselves spiritually. This has to be formed. Now, whether that's formed into a relationship, or it's formed into a business, or it's formed into an artistic project, this is of how creativity comes to form something of us in our lives. And this parched nature is really something that's quite helpful to set against what we previously looked at in terms of the water within the cube, this water of life, that this growing new knowledge of this etheric experience of how our character is changing, is giving us this experience of water. The parched nature of this first beast is how we are, in German, schrumpfen, how we are shrinking into a bony form that is the opposite of that process. And that's the challenge at this time, to recognize that part of us is going through this, also collectively, humanity, going through this process of fear of the spiritual. But to the extent that we see this, we can develop this other growing etheric experience of water, as we looked in relation to the cube at the beginning. Why have I added this very strange picture at the top of a family looking at a screen? Well, I quite like this. First of all, for the little flames everywhere underneath the screen. And then I think the family here are regarding another family on the screen. So it's very much, I feel, this mirroring process of coming to see ourselves from outside, to regard events out on a screen, a bit like as we were previously talking about with the different surfaces of the cube, to see ourselves as we go out into time and into space before us, recognizing that when we look at something before us and we go out into the world before us, we're immediately creating counter space. Then recognizing that each of us has an ich, a place of observation of our thinking that we set over against the activity of our thinking, but also the activity of our feeling and of our willing. And to the extent that we're working with these 4 dimensions, what Judith von Haller calls 4 buds, is the extent that we understand these 4 bodies of the human being: the physical, the etheric, the astral, and the ich. And to the extent that we do this, we're forming our imagination, that we can then call a spirit self, and a new life, etherically, through this work, through this raised consciousness, we start to develop a life spirit. Now, all of that comes very nicely into this cube aspect here, like a screen. And it's very helpful to think of that as a cube, as a screen. We're often looking at screens the whole time, and you're probably watching me on this screen. So all of this going back, there you go. I was talking as if you could all see that, but there it is. All of this going back to our central image of the seventh seal, here with the cube, and then with the three higher members above. So that's where we're up to for today. Any comments? Love to hear any feedback. It's great. Always helps me put on new things and bring new things into the videos I do. So all the comments that I get through the week, I try to weave them in to the videos that I do. So I wish you all a very nice growing experience in these weeks leading up to Michaelmas, and all the best. I'll put the Judith von Haller quote in the comments below, and I shall see you soon. Ciao, ciao.